Okay, live, and we can go ahead and get started. Looks like the volume is working. Let me just go ahead and get that out of the way. So, welcome and thank you for coming to this lecture. Today, I, Dr. Jack Stack, your guide through evolutionary biology, is going to be talking about the history of evolutionary biology and the history of evolutionary thought. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, you may have seen my previous lecture on the evolutionary perspective. Today, we're going to be building off of those ideas. So, a quick review of what we've learned so far. The core of science is that we ask how, not why. We don't ask why life exists. We don't ask why there's so much diversity of life. We ask how. How is there so much diversity of life? How did this happen, right? And what we centered on in modern evolutionary biology is a series of ideas that we're going to trace the history of today. Ideas are like living things. They have a lineage. They have a history that extends back into the past. So the aims of modern evolutionary biology come in three forms. Number one is the idea that all biological phenomena, which is living things and non-living things that act like living things, a virus, can be explained by natural mechanisms. This is a core idea in evolutionary biology. And this is what makes evolutionary biology a scientific discipline, is that we explain nature in terms of nature. This doesn't mean that there aren't things outside of nature, but as a science, we can only explain nature in terms of nature. The second idea is that this thing we call evolution is what is descent with modification or diversification, which means that living things have a shared lineage that you can trace back into the past to the first living thing. And that over time, living things change, right? So evolution is this idea that living things change with time and have some shared history, right? That is the idea of evolution. And as we're going to learn, there is also this idea that evolution is not one natural mechanism, but it's actually several natural mechanisms that work in tandem. And we're going to learn today that this idea is actually relatively new in the history of evolutionary biology. And finally, living things and their characteristics can only be understood in the context of their history. What does this mean? Well, this means that if we want to understand living things, including ourselves, we have to put them into a historical context. Point number two tells us that there is a history of life, right? There is this descent with modification. There are changes. Living things today are not identical to living things 1,000 years, 100,000, million years ago, right? So to understand living things, we have to put them in the context of their history. So how did we get here, right? There's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot of ideas. And I think it's important for students of evolution and practitioners of evolutionary science both to understand where these ideas come from. They did not just pop out of the ground, right? You can't go into nature and find this slide, right? This is based on observations of the natural world that have been going on for thousands of years. And today we're going to briefly review that history, right? We could do a whole class on the history of evolutionary biology. But today we're going to go through some core, the goal is to trace the history of these ideas back in time, to understand where they came from. Why do we think these things, right? How did these ideas come to light, right? Because remember, nature and humans, right? Even though science is based on the study of nature objectively, humans are subjective, right? So what we're going to learn is that there is a history of ideas and there is bias associated with that. So when we think about the history of science, there's a lot of ways to do this. My goal is not to have like a list of names and dates that you memorize, but rather to try to trace the history of these ideas into time, how they have changed and where they come from. How do we think these things? Right? So a critical framework is the idea that we're going to study history as it was. I'm going to teach you some things about people who did good things, people who did bad things. The goal is not to label people as villains or heroes, or this person was a genius, this person was an idiot. That's not the goal. The goal is to understand the history as it was and understand how it influences what we think today. So we're going to focus on important events and discoveries, but we're not trying to say this person's great and this person's terrible. That's not the point, right? I'll let you make those decisions on your own. As we're going to see, there are some people who have made very important contributions. We're not good people. And the reason for this, right, is that like living things, to fully understand ideas, we have to put them in the context of their history. Because there's this really important idea that actually a lot of people and a lot of scientists specifically get wrong, which is bias. There is this idea in science and in big tech that if you have more data, you will get closer to the right answer. And as if you have hundreds of thousands or millions or even billions of data points, that you're going to get so close to knowing everything, right? And to some extent, that is true, but there is this problem that we call bias. And today, we're going to learn about bias. And a little mistake here. It's supposed to say evolutionary biology, not comparative anatomy. My bad. So this is a common image on the internet, and I think it's important to understand what this means. So this image is a drawing showing where bombers returning from bombing runs in World War II in England were sustaining damage, right? So the red dots indicate where they were finding damage from anti-aircraft guns and other airplanes, right? Now, there's two ways to interpret this. You can say these are the areas that are getting damaged. We should focus on reinforcing those areas, but notice where the lack of damage is. The lack of damage is at the cockpit, the engines, kind of the middle of the wings, right? The tail fin, or the connection between the body of the plane and the tail fin, I think that's what it's called. Those are places where if the plane gets hit, the plane doesn't come back, right? That's called survivor bias. When you're only looking at the survivors of a problem, you will not fully understand the problem, right? This is, if you are a younger person, you may have heard from your parents or your grandparents, like, well, we used to ride around without seatbelts all the time and we were fine. It's like, but you're only hearing from the survivors, right? People who died because they weren't wearing a seatbelt are not around today to tell you that you should wear a seatbelt, right? So survivorship bias is one type of bias, but it's part of a broader phenomenon in studying the world. It's in science, statistics, it's everywhere. So in science, right, we're trying to make better predictions. As we discussed in our evolutionary perspective lecture, there is no such thing as fully objective truth in science. We never fully 100% are sure of anything, right? Because we can always falsify and continue to test science. But the goal is to make more accurate predictions. And you can think of this like throwing darts at a dartboard, right? As you get better at throwing darts at the dartboard, the goal is that you'll get better at hitting the target, right? And you'll get closer and closer to the bullseye. And as you practice and as you do more, you're going to get better and better, but you're never going to, like 100% of the time, hit the exact same spot, right? Because there's always a little bit of randomness, right? If you've ever played a sport, right? If you're trying to throw a ball and hit the exact right spot 100 times out of 100, you're going to be pretty good at it, right? You could be a pro pitcher and be able to do it very, very well. You could be Steph Curry and be really good at hitting threes, but he doesn't hit every single one, right? Because there's a little bit of randomness, right? Maybe he gets a little tired. Maybe there's a slight breeze. Maybe he just a little bit off. There's a weird bounce of the ball, right? Never 100%. But the goal of science, right, is to get as close as we can so we can understand nature accurately. Gathering more data reduces the effect of randomness. So in any study of the real world, in any attempt to understand the real world, there is randomness. There's always going to be some amount of unpredictable noise, essentially, right? This is Steph Curry trying to hit threes, right? He's probably going to miss a couple, right? He's not going to hit every single time, but overall, right, the more he shoots, right, the more he's going to make. And if you wanted to learn how to do it, right, the more you practice, the better you're going to get. Similar idea applies in science, right? The more data we gather, the less noise is going to affect our overall result. And this is where you get this idea of, well, if I have more data, then I'm always going to have the right answer, which is not correct. Because there is noise, and then there is bias. And the problem with bias is that as you gather more data, you're going to be more certain of the wrong answer. Now, here's the difference between bias and noise. Noise is random, right? It's random little things you can't predict. Bias is when you have basically, it would be if you're throwing darts at the dartboard, but you're convinced that the target is somewhere else, right? For whatever reason. As you continue to practice doing the wrong thing, you're going to get better and better at hitting the wrong part of the dartboard, right? This is if you are gathering more and more data, but there's something you're overlooking, right? Some bias in your thinking. You're not, if we were to review or go back a little bit here, as you collect more and more data from these planes, you'll be more and more certain that these are the areas where they're taking damage, right? And if you don't recognize your bias, you're going to say, well, we never see any damage on the cockpit or the engines. Clearly, those don't need any reinforcement. What we really need to reinforce is these other parts because you're gathering more data and you're getting more and more certain, right? Now, this one seems like, oh, this is so obvious. How can anyone make this mistake? Scientists make this mistake all the time, myself included. I am not free. Nobody is free from bias, right? Bias and noise are part of scientific inquiry. You cannot get rid of them completely, and nobody is free of it. But what we have to do as scientists and as citizens is recognize our bias, find it, and try to circumvent it. So here's a story from my personal work. I went to the Smithsonian to examine fossil fish specimens earlier this year, and they had this specimen in their fossil fish cabinets. And I was really excited because I thought that this was a jaw from a fish that nobody had described. And I spent an hour with this thing under the microscope, and I was describing what I thought were teeth. And I'm like, wow, this is so interesting. And I'm so excited, and I think this is a new species. And I look up the name that is on the drawer, right? And it turns out that this was originally described as a fish, as I thought it was. But when people revisited this, they found this is actually not bone. It's not a fish jaw. It's actually the mandibles of an ancient shrimp. So it kind of looks like a fish jaw, this part here, right? It kind of looks like a fish jaw when you separate it from the rest of the animal, right? So there is two sources of bias here. Number one, I'm not looking at the whole animal, or I'm looking at a piece of the animal. And number two, I am a fish scientist. I focus on fishes. I have described fossil fishes, complete and from jaws, both. So when I see this fossil, my brain is matching it to what I already know. I am not an expert on fossil arthropods whatsoever, right? So I am not free from bias. You are not free from bias. And the people we're going to meet in the past are not free from bias. What we can do is recognize our bias by studying the history of our science so that we can make more accurate predictions. So we can avoid hitting the wrong part of the target and thinking that we're doing great, right? So we're going to rewind here. In the history of evolution. The history of evolution goes, as an idea, goes back very deep into human history. The history of this idea is really tied to the rise of civilization in places like Africa and Asia, whether we're thinking about Egypt, whether we're thinking about India, whether we're thinking about China, right? A lot of the history of our understanding of evolution actually arises from the study of people initially. So these are early medical texts. So that we have 1600 BC, we have 6th century BC, 400 BC, right? These are all medical texts from different parts of the world, different people. And the reason this is important is that some of the first written down work that we would call basically proto-science is people studying medicine, studying the human body, studying how we work, right? And so these are different medical texts and different, basically, people thinking about what are we, right? Because remember, the study of evolution in all of science is really trying to understand how we fit into the world, right? And a lot of the earliest science that that evolution has its roots in is the study of human beings. And prior to the Middle Ages, right, a lot of this research is being done in Greece, Egypt, India, China, right? People in these advanced civilizations trying to better understand themselves and the world around them, right? So people like Aristotle, right, who are trying to understand the natural world, going into the natural world and looking at living things, looking at themselves, and essentially at this point, that we would not call this what they're doing science. We call it natural philosophy, right? Thinking about nature, thinking about humans and our place in the world. And in the Middle Ages, and I know we're skipping past a lot, but what we need to understand, right, is that in sort of this more ancient tradition, you're directly studying nature, going out, looking at things, and thinking very clearly about what is nature and how do we fit into it. In the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, a lot of this thinking and a lot of scientific inquiry is essentially replaced by theology, right, which has a rich history. And what we're doing in theology is trying to understand humans, our connection to the divine, right, in the soul and the spirit. And this arises from things like medicine. In these early medical texts, by the way, it's not just about anatomy, it's not just about the human body as a machine. They're also thinking about the spirit and what we would call the soul and all those things, right? So in this theological tradition, there is a lot less going into nature and studying nature, and a lot more basically philosophy tied with our ideas of God and our ideas of the human soul and all of that good stuff. And essentially, right, we have natural philosophy, medicine, theology happening in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia. And one of the most important figures in this is Ibn Sina, who is a Persian philosopher and what we would today call a scientist. And this is where essentially our first idea of what we would call evolution shows up as part of human beings thinking about nature. And Ibn Sina wrote this and wrote a really important textbook in medicine that also talks about the history of life. It talks about like the connection of living things, geology, all sorts of good stuff, right? So this is ideas of evolution, right? And there's people who argue that Aristotle also had proto-evolutionary ideas, although that's a little bit controversial. But essentially, the idea that living things have a history, that they've changed, that there is a common history of living things is thousands of years old, right? It's a very old idea that emerged as people were studying themselves and their place in the world, all across the world, right? Greece, China, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, all these places, right? And a lot of this, again, is tied to medical study, right? A lot of these early evolutionary ideas come from people who were actually physicians, right? What we would call today a physician. Because again, they're studying the human body as a machine, but they're also studying our place in the world, our spirit, our connection with nature, all of that good stuff, right? And some of these ideas, again, they're coming from all over the world. These people don't know about each other, right? We're skipping over centuries, right? Thousands of years even of thought. But people like Albertus Magnus, right, had early ideas that we would call evolutionary in nature, right? And if you are not Catholic, Albertus Magnus is actually the patron saint of scientists, which is interesting. Learned about that as I was going. And you can see, right, even in this piece of art, right, you have a scientist, a thinker, interacting with a divine figure, right? Which I think is very interesting. Now, a really important transition, though, is we're going to go from thinking about our place in the world to studying our place in the world as a scientific discipline. All of these people are practicing what we would call natural philosophy, right? They are thinking about and making logical arguments about our place in the world, which is great, but it's not what we do in science today. You will remember that scientists, right? I don't just sit and think about, what was the anatomy of this fish, right? You go and you make observations of the natural world to test your predictions, right? And a major figure in the transition in the way we think about the world and the way that we approach these ideas is someone named Andreas Vesalius. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. You'll notice we've skipped hundreds of years, right? We're in the 1500s now. But this person is so important because his work helped spark a change in how we approach nature. And he's establishing something called comparative anatomy, which we're going to see is really important to evolution. Evolution arises pretty much from comparative anatomy. So the science that gives birth to evolution, comparative anatomy, really starts with this man. Not because people hadn't thought about anatomy before, people had, but the scientific discipline of studying ourselves, where we go and we make observations of the body, observations of nature, right? And we record those observations. Really, like, this is one of the first figures that we have. Not the only one, right? But a very, very important and influential one. So this drawing, which I think it's very interesting as a scientific drawing, right? Because you can see this, a naked man is standing and looking out at a town. I'm not sure which town that's supposed to be. But this is not purely philosophy, right? Not that there's anything wrong with philosophy, but this is science, because he is drawing and labeling all of these muscles, and you can go and verify if these things actually exist, right? This is what we would call a scientific document, right? Scientific observation. And this work, these drawings, are based on dissections of cadavers, right? Based on studying nature, right? So he's making observations of nature to inform what he thinks about the world. Not the first person to do this, I want to be very clear, but in the tradition of ideas and thinking and discipline that we today call evolutionary biology, this is one of the earliest figures, right? Prior to this, right, a lot of anatomical knowledge, and remember, we're going to get to how evolutionary biology emerges from anatomy, but there were hundreds of years where anatomical knowledge is passed down from classical sources without criticism. So people like Andreas Vesalius and his contemporaries were studying classical sources of knowledge, but for centuries, basically being a natural philosopher was studying the classics, but not going out into nature and making observations for yourself, right? So, for example, we have Galen, who is this great Roman philosopher, natural philosopher, and you can see he is doing a dissection of a monkey. And a lot of these, like, kind of anatomical knowledge of people was based on his treatises, which are based on dissecting monkeys. I forget. Oh, gosh. This is a Barbary macaque, which is a type of monkey that Galen dissected. Now, why Barbary macaques? Well, here's a source of bias in Galen's knowledge. And again, Galen was a genius of his day, but here's a source of bias. Guess what you're not allowed to dissect in ancient Rome? People. It is illegal to dissect a human cadaver in ancient Rome during Galen's time. He would actually, when I was preparing this lecture, I found that he would tell his students to go to the beach and look for washed up, decomposing sailors to study anatomy, right? So they were allowed to dissect monkeys, but they're not allowed to dissect people, right? So his knowledge of anatomy, right, is biased. Not because he's a bad person or because he's a fool or anything like that, but because of the laws and restrictions of his society during his time, right? And this is over 1,000 years before Andreas Vesalius. And a lot of these physicians, doctors, are studying classical sources, but they're not going into nature and trying to disprove them, right? Because that's Galen's work. Why would you try to disprove Galen, right? So what we're seeing is this transition from kind of this copying work from the past to going into nature and making observations for yourself. And it's a huge transition, right? Very, very important. Something funny from this is apparently for hundreds of years, doctors were taught that men and women have a different number of teeth based on Galen's work, which is not objectively not correct, right? This is something that if you were a scientist today, right, you would think, well, I can just, I can look in someone's mouth, I can look in my own mouth, I can look, I could get a specimen, right, look and see how many teeth, right? Pretty easy study to design, but it just wasn't part of the way that they approached these problems, right? They weren't thinking, oh, I need to go disprove this. They're like, well, this is what I was taught, right? So as the Renaissance is progressing, right, we see the progression of the scientific discipline of anatomy, right? Things like Antoine von Leeuwenhoek inventing the microscope, right? We're seeing more experiments. We're seeing more study of the natural world, right? So this is a section of an ash tree, and this is showing the first observations of cells, right? So we're learning more about the structure of living things, ourselves included. And as we're going to see, learning about the structure of living things is going to start giving us ideas about what we're going to call evolution. A really important figure in this is a man named Edward Tyson, who is an English physician. And Edward Tyson begins what we would call modern comparative anatomy. Prior to Tyson, we're thinking about people, right? Whether we might be dissecting a monkey like Galen is, but we're interested in human beings. Tyson extends the science by starting to compare people to other animals, right? Trying to understand our place in nature. And remember, during this time in the 1600s, right, they're not thinking about evolution, they're thinking about divine creation, right? Trying to understand God's creation. So he's an English physician and what we would call a scientist working in the 1700s. And he did scientific studies that described humans and other organisms in terms of what we now call homologous structures or shared structures, right? And just the fact that when you dissect a human and you dissect something like a chimpanzee or a whale or a dolphin and you see shared structures is really interesting, right? When you dissect these animals and conduct comparative anatomy, right, conduct this science, you're making observations, you're making arguments, right, that these soft structures between something like a person and a chimpanzee are shared, right? You are making a scientific hypothesis and you start to notice something interesting, right? It's like, wow, so chimpanzees are more like humans than they are monkeys. Whales are actually mammals. They share structures with humans and chimpanzees that they don't share with something like a shark or something like a fish, right? So they live in the water, but they're mammals. They breathe air like we do, right? They have lungs like a human does, not gills like a fish does, right? So this comparative anatomy, this study of the natural world, and interrogation of the natural world, is where the first sort of sparks of the ideas of evolution are going to arise. And as people are studying anatomy, we start to see more works on natural history. So this is Buffon. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his full French name. It's funny. He's the Count of Buffon, which is just a plot of land that he bought and then named himself the Count of, because he was a very important natural historian. He was the keeper of the French royalties, what's called their Cabinet of Nature or Cabinet of Curiosities, which, because they were royalty, was what we would today call a museum, right? He and his contemporary, Linnaeus, are two of the most important figures in natural history during the 1700s. So if you've taken a biology course, you've probably heard of Linnaeus. If you haven't, I will remind you. Linnaeus is a man who came up with the system of classification of animals and plants and other living things that we still use to this day. If you've heard the idea that humans are Homo sapiens, right, or if you've heard the idea that living things have a formal or Latin name, You have Linnaeus to thank for that. Linnaeus had this idea that we should have a shared set of rules and classification systems for all living things, using Latin and Greek, which are dead languages, right? So that there is a common, remember, Latin and Greek were the language of science at this time, right? Are one of the primary languages of science. And to this day, there are still botanical works where there is an abstract written in Latin, which I think is interesting. Now, Buffon and Linnaeus were rivals at their time. They both made very important contributions that are important for understanding evolution. So as I mentioned, Linnaeus came up with what we call the Systema Naturae, right? Which is this Latin formal system of classifying life, first part of which comes out in 1758. It has this very long Latin title. By the way, his name is Carolea Linnae, right? And that's the Latin version of his name. So this is a hierarchical system of organizing living things. The idea here, right, is every living thing can be organized in a series of boxes, essentially. And as you move down the system, as you go from class to order to genus to species, you're getting more and more specific. For example, Homo sapiens is our species, right? Every human being alive today is a member of the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. If you go back tens of thousands of years, you would find other species of humans like Homo neanderthalensis, which is a member of the same genus, but a different species of human, a very closely related species of human, right? And as you go back in time, right, Homo erectus, right? You keep going back in time, you get Australopithecus, right? A different genus altogether, right? So you get more specific, less specific, hierarchical organization. And in Linnaeus's idea, these are fixed ranks, right? Linnaeus is not an evolutionist or an evolutionary scientist. Linnaeus's idea is that we need this system to unify our knowledge of living things that God created, right? That this is, he believes that God has chosen him to classify creation, to reveal the divine plan behind life, right? Linnaeus does not think that there is change occurring, right? And I have had students bring this up and they're very correct, right? The problem with this system, right, is you say, well, this says that all human beings are this thing, right? Homo sapiens. But when you look across human beings, right, there's plenty of variation, right? Human beings don't all look the same. We're not all the same height. We're not all the same skin color. We don't all talk the same. We don't all look the same, right? There's a lot of variation. And with Linnaeus and with a lot of these people, they really like the idea that there is this sort of unified thing that is a human being, right? And there are deviations from it. But Homo sapiens is this definable, concrete thing to Linnaeus. The same thing applies to all other living things, right? The idea that all living things can be classified by this system. And what Linnaeus believes is because they've all been created by God, and God has chosen him to reveal this plan. Buffon is a critic of Linnaeus in his time. So in his time, Buffon is best known for writing these natural history, general and particular, of the royal cabinet, right? So the royal cabinet of Paris is the royal museum, right? It's the collection of natural history of the French monarchy, right? Which is today a museum, right? And it eventually gets renamed because there's this revolution that happens. But Buffon is a critic of Linnaeus because Linnaeus is saying, when I'm classifying a species, right, I'm saying all human beings are the same thing, right? There are these fixed species for Linnaeus. But Buffon argues that there are transformations and there is important variation. So some of the earliest ideas of evolution actually come from Buffon, where based on comparative anatomy, based on heredity, right, he's saying there are transformations, there are changes that are clearly happening. For example, he argued that all human beings actually have one origin, and part of the reason we see differences in human beings is climate, or I mix those two words together, climate and diet, right? Like, well, Some people have lighter skin where they're exposed to less sun, darker skin where they're exposed to more sun, right? Doesn't know about genetics, doesn't know about natural selection and evolution and all these things, right? But he's basically arguing, right? Look, yes, there is a human species, but there are transformations, right? There are changes that are happening. Species are probably not fixed things. These ideas were not accepted in their time. Very much the scientific community of the time loved Linnaeus's ideas. Linnaeus is and especially was this revered figure in natural science. And I use the word revered very specifically, right? Linnaeus was considered the greatest scientist of his time in natural history. Buffon is also considered great, right? But his ideas were not accepted during this time, right? Unfortunately. Now, as we continue in the scientific tradition, right, arising from these Linnaean ideas is this generation of scientists that go out into the world and seek to classify living things, right? Now there is this drive to find and classify living things on an enormous scale. People go all over the world looking for new species, right? It becomes basically a competition as to who can name and find the most new species, right? And integrate them within this Linnaean system of classification. One of the most important of these people is a man named Cuvier. Cuvier is a French comparative anatomist. He is the founder of the field that we now call vertebrate paleontology or just paleontology. And his major contribution to this science and to our story, he has two major contributions to our story. The first is that he is one of the first people to classify living and fossil species. Linnaeus is interested in things that are alive today. Cuvier is interested in anatomical specimens, including fossils, right? And Cuvier makes this argument that fossil species can be different from living species, right? And he is classifying fossil species on the basis of their anatomy. He is one of the greatest anatomists, right, of his time. He is a revered figure in science. He is considered the greatest natural historian of his day, right? He also establishes, on the basis of studying fossil species, that there are species that have gone extinct. This is a major change. To Linnaeus and to scientists before, the idea is that no species have gone extinct. That even they interpreted fossils as animals that are, maybe they're not here now, but they're somewhere else, right? Fun story here. President Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition to explore the newly purchased Louisiana Purchase, right? And Thomas Jefferson, being a learned man of his day, knew about things like fossil mastodons and mammoths and ground sloths, right? In fact, one of the giant ground sloths in America is named after Thomas Jefferson, Jeffersonite. And he tells Lewis and Clark to look for mammoths and mastodons in the western part of the United States. Because Jefferson believes, as other people believed in that day, that no species in God's creation had gone extinct, right? We don't see mastodons on the east coast of the United States anymore, but they probably still exist in the West. What Cuvier proves later on, we'll talk about this, is that mammoths are extinct species. Very importantly, Cuvier is not an evolutionary scientist. He is a strong opponent of evolutionary ideas. One of his contemporaries, whose name is escaping me in this moment. Oh my gosh, what is his name? Oh, it's a very French name. Lamarck. Lamarck is a contemporary of Cuvier who argues basically a proto-evolutionary theory, right? Not what we would call natural selection, but Cuvier basically destroys Lamarck and his career, right? And wins this battle against evolutionary ideas, right? Just as Linnaeus beat out Buffon, Cuvier beats out Lamarck, right? So evolution did not start with Darwin. Really important thing. Darwin is not the first person to think about evolution, right? Evolution had been thought about for hundreds of years at least prior to Darwin. But he is the first person, and we'll talk about this, to get it widely accepted. Cuvier is also his fourth really important but unfortunate contribution is he is at the root of what we call modern scientific racism. Racism has existed throughout human beings forever, unfortunately. But the idea, if you've ever heard of the idea that like people with larger heads are smarter, or that like different types of people are different species and some of these species are superior to others, Cuvier was a strong proponent of this idea called polygenism. And polygenism is the idea that different races of humans are actually different species with different origins. And Cuvier, and I'm not going to read you his writing, right? But he wrote some really just awful stuff about how basically the white European race is superior to people like Africans, essentially, and other races, including Native Americans, Asian people, right? All that stuff. And this included, by the way, keeping a South African woman in captivity, right? Who actually died in captivity, named Sarah Bartman, whose remains are finally returned. They were actually in the collection of the French Museum until the year 2002, which is horrifying, right? So, as I mentioned, polygenism, idea that human races are distinct species. A lot of those ideas actually originate with, and were given a lot of legitimacy by Cuvier, right? So this man who made these very important contributions to our sciences, including the science that I practice, vertebrate paleontology, argued essentially that human races are fixed species, rather than being Homo sapiens, one species, that there are fixed species within that differ in anatomy, intelligence, right, and don't change with time, right? He's arguing that any difference in intelligence or anatomy between two people who are different races is because they're part of different fixed species that don't change, right? Not access to education or environment or anything like that. I'm not going to reproduce the original writings. You can go find them on your own. And look, I'm not trying to make my own personal ideas bleed into this, but I'm just going to say I think that they're vile, just to identify my own bias here. But we have to understand, right? This is part of the history of the field, right? And part of the history of evolution as an idea is it is unfortunately intertwined with the history of scientific racism, right? Unfortunate, but true. Ironically, comparative anatomy that was done by enslaved Africans, enslaved black people, actually informed Cuvier, which is something he was aware of at the time, believe it or not. So this is a fossilized mammoth tooth. These types of fossils were found in North America. People still continue to find fossilized mammoths and mastodons as they're farming, as they're digging basements, digging quarries, all these things. And they're very distinctive, right? This is clearly not just a normal rock. And people find these, right, and want to know what they are. In the Stono plantation in North Carolina in the year 1725, right, slaves are digging and they come across these giant teeth, right? What's going on? Well, coincidentally, an English botanist who's traveling through North America, right, records this incident. He records enslaved people digging up mammoth teeth and saying that they're elephant teeth, right? Because they were enslaved from Africa and were familiar with what elephant teeth look like. And they recognized that these look like the teeth of a giant animal that eats grass, which is similar to an elephant. And interestingly enough, right, this same logical connection is made by Cuvier about 70-ish years later. And he actually we know that he read Mark Catesby's account, right? And this helped influence his ideas, right? And it's just this interesting fact, right? That this person who is at the root of a lot of scientific racism was influenced by an observation made by enslaved persons. And again, Cuvier's major contribution to the idea of extinction is that when we find a fossilized elephant skeleton that he named Mammuthus, that when we compare this to something like an Indian elephant, right, and we compare the teeth, we can see, and this is 1798, so not quite 70 years. That would be what? 73 years later? I think that's right. Yeah. So 73 years later, Cuvier publishes this paper that shows, right, comparative anatomy between an Indian elephant and a mammoth, showing that they are similar but not identical species, right? And he makes the argument that a mammoth is an extinct species of elephant. Again, partially influenced by these observations. And this should show you a bias in our knowledge of science. Is you may have heard the phrase, history is written by the winners, right? And that's part of survivorship bias. If you lose a war and die, right, you're not writing history. If you are somebody who does not have access to resources, who is looked down upon because of your race or because you are poor, right, your ideas are less likely to make it into the lexicon of science, right? So that is a bias in science, right, that unfortunately continues to this very day. It's a lot easier to be a scientist if you have money. So, sorry for that repeat of slides. But essentially what's going on, right, and Cuvier is just one example of this. Essentially what's going on is that, and you can see that this is from the 1500s, this is from a scientist named Pierre Bellon, which is studying birds. Essentially, as people are looking at anatomy, making observations between humans and animals, they start noticing these patterns of similarity, right? And this is why, right, like the reason that Linnaeus has a hierarchical system in the first place is that some organisms are more similar to each other than they are to other organisms, right? And this extends to both living animals and, as Cuvier shows, fossil animals, right? So there are these patterns of similarity among living things. Very important work in this is Richard Owen's book on the nature of limbs, which is one of the most important anatomical works that's ever been written. Richard Owen is a British anatomist working in the 1800s. And Owen is a great comparative anatomist on a lot of things. And he is the keeper of the British Museum of Natural History. And what Owen shows scientifically is that when you compare the limbs of different vertebrate animals, like a person, bird, dog, I believe that's an alligator, although I'm not 100% certain now that I look at it. Pretty sure that's an alligator. When you compare these limbs, you see shared parts. You see homologous traits between these animals, right? And he's extending and building upon the work of people like Tyson, people like Cuvier, as people are going out into the world and collecting more and more animals from a broader region, living and fossil. We're seeing these very striking patterns of similarity down to things like the toe and finger bones, right? There is variation, but these variations are in shared structures. When you compare the limbs of all of these different animals, you see shared structures. You see similarity in form. It almost looks like the same parts have been modified to construct different structures. You have the same parts that have been modified to construct a wing, a paddle, an arm, a digging claw, a column for supporting weight, right? So Owen and others are comparing all of these different animals, and they're saying, look at these shared structures. These are the arms, by the way, and if you take a moment to look at your arm, you have one bone at your shoulder called your humerus. You have two bones, your ulna, which is your elbow, and your radius, which is closer to your wrist, right? Ulna, radius. You have your carpals, which are your wrist bones, your metacarpals, which are the bones of your palm, and you have your phalanges, which are your fingers. That fundamental pattern is shared between all vertebrates. You can go to something like a chicken, has the same pattern. It's been modified. They don't have as many fingers as you do, but they still have fingers, right? Even though they don't actually have separate fingers that do anything anymore, right? So what Owen is recognizing is like, hey, not only is there a hierarchical similarity between animals, but it goes that like you dissect these animals and you see this similarity and these shared forms. And where evolutionary biology emerges from comparative anatomy is trying to explain these patterns, right? It's one thing to make the observation of these patterns, right? These drawings, right? And if we go to the more technical drawings that Owen has, right? These are facts, right? You can go and you can dissect a pigeon if you really want, and you can find these bones, right? But how do we explain these patterns? That is the extension of science, right? How do we explain something? Well, that's where we're going to get into evolutionary biology. So comparative anatomy shows common forms exist across disparate groups, right? And this similarity in form has a hierarchical distribution. This is why the Linnaean system works, right? Part of the reason the Linnaean system was so popular in its time and continues to be used to this day is that it works really well. There is a hierarchical distribution of similarity. You, a human being, are more similar to a chimpanzee than you are to a gorilla. You, the chimpanzee, and the gorilla are more similar to each other than you are to an orangutan, right? All of these apes are more similar to each other than they are to monkeys, right? And you can do this across the history of life. This works really, really well. So the question is, how? How did we get this hierarchical distribution, right? For hundreds of years, the idea was this is how God created life. I'm not endorsing a religious ideal here, but a lot of the people who were doing this work were Christian, and they believed, people like Linnaeus, people like Buffon, people like Owen, believed that this is how God created life, right? And they were revealing the pattern of life, and this is God's creation. What we're going to see, and this is just a restatement, we're going to see is we're going to extend from using God as a explainer to trying to find a natural mechanism to explain this. And just to be very clear, what I mean by hierarchical distribution is that humans and chimpanzees are more similar to each other than they are to monkeys. Monkeys, humans, and chimpanzees are more similar to each other than they are to lemurs, right? Boxes within boxes. Hierarchical distribution of similarity. Russian nesting dolls, right? It's a box within a box within a box, right? Now, all of that was comparative anatomy, right? Leading to proto-evolutionary ideas. But there's another really important science that we have to talk about, which is geology. Geology has its own history. Actually, some of the earliest geological works were also done by Ibn Sina, who we met earlier, interestingly enough. We're going to briefly talk about geology because geology's evolution and change directly influences what we're going to call evolution. So the science of geology, the discipline of geology, emerges in the 19th century, right? Geology being the study of the earth, structure, history, composition, all that good stuff. And because of the Industrial Revolution, right? Because geology, basically you need the study of the earth to get resources, right? To get fuel, to build, right? Geology grows very quickly in the Industrial Revolution. It's an incredibly important science to the Industrial Revolution, right? It existed before then, but when you start needing earth resources at a massive scale and being able to find those resources and understand the earth becomes very, very important, right? And the way you can think about this is geology is the study of rocks, right? Not Dwayne the Rock Johnson. Very important to distinguish that. Geology is the study of rocks, not the rock, right? Now, a little bit on the history of geology, right? A really important part of geology is the science of stratigraphy, which is the study of rock layers, right? So I know it's going to be a little bit of like, yeah, I'm so excited, but it is very important, right? So people like Nicholas Steno and James Hutton and other scientists are studying and thinking about not living things, but the earth, right? And what are the processes and systems of the earth itself? And for a long time, before I get into that, for a long time, the idea was that the earth is very young and characterized by catastrophic processes as described in the Bible, right? So the idea is the earth is approximately 6,000 years old, as described in the Bible. And because we have things like Noah's flood in the Bible, that basically the structures we see in the earth are a result of things like the biblical flood. As people start to study earth system processes, they start seeing things that are not consistent with those ideas. So, for example, they start studying things like erosion. They see that big rocks are broken down into little rocks. Those little rocks get washed into the ocean, get washed into a lake. They basically come together and form a new rock, right? So they start seeing, okay, they start observing these processes and seeing this is how a rock forms. This is how a rock breaks. This is something we call this erosion. We call this weathering. We call these layers of sediment strata, right? And as we're studying these processes, right, we start learning things like, hey, because a rock forms in an environment, we can actually learn about the environment that the rock came from, right? If you find fish and aquatic plants and snails in a rock, that means it probably formed in an ocean, right? Pretty basic logic here. So the type of rock tells us about the original environment. If we find a bunch of fossils of corals and shells and stuff, it probably formed in a coral reef, right? So this logic becomes really important. We start studying the Earth system to understand its history, right? We learn that rocks form as a product of their environment. Very, very important, right? And this is why people have been finding fossil shells in weird places for thousands of years, right? But as the science of geology starts to develop, we learn how this is happening, right? How do you find shells on top of a mountain? Well, that mountaintop used to be a coral reef. Now, a couple of important ideas here, right? We see these layers in the rock, right? And Nicholas Steno argues, based on observation, that when strata are forming, when rock layers are forming, they form initially horizontal layers, right? And you can replicate this experiment yourself. You can pour dirt into a glass of water, and you can see that you're going to get horizontal layers of dirt, right? You could do this with air, you could do this with water, right? You get horizontal layers. And as you're studying these horizontal layers of rock, helped by the fact that we're building, we're digging quarries, right? We're getting more access to rocks, right? They also argue, logically, right, if you have multiple layers of rocks, the strata at the bottom of a stack of sediment were deposited first. Think about this, right? If this is forming, and this is a limestone quarry that represents a series of ancient lakes, if you have a lake that is depositing sediment, right, the sediments at the bottom should be the oldest, right? Because for this sediment to form, there has to be something underneath it for it to stack on top of, right? So the oldest rocks are at the bottom, and as you go up, you get younger and younger. Cool, right? So we get horizontal layers of rock that get younger as you move closer to the surface. Perfect. Now, this only tells you relative age, right? This doesn't tell you exactly how old a rock is. In a later lecture, by the way, I will cover the science of figuring out exactly how old a rock is, which does not exist during the 1800s, by the way, as a 20th century innovation. But these scientists figure out, hey, I can figure out the relative age of rocks. Well, when people start going and studying the natural world, they go into mountains and canyons, right? This is in North America, but they're doing similar things in like the Alps, right? And you start studying all these layers of rock, you notice something really interesting, which is, number one, there's a lot of rock here, right? But as you start studying the rocks, you notice, hey, there are these really different environments that are represented by these rocks. The type of rock, the type of fossil is changing radically as I go through these rocks, right? We know from our principle of original horizontality that this is the oldest and this is the youngest. And we know from our study of how rocks form today that the living things and pebbles and things like that that are incorporated in these rocks come from the time the rock formed, right? But notice, we have deep sea, reef, coastline, swamp, desert, right? The environment is changing. And when you study the environment today, like you don't go from a coral reef to a swamp in a year, right? So they're starting as scientists go out and start to characterize the Earth's surface, the rocks, the environments, the fossils. Basically, they start to see, hey, the Earth is like old. There's a lot of changes that are happening here. And this is really the building of what we now